Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come right on in. We're grateful for having you. Shaka, hello. Good to see you digitally. And where is everyone from? Let's throw some area codes and some things in the chat so we know where our lovely audience is hailing from. Syracuse, there we go. Albany, Rochester, yes, yes. Ithaca, Poughkeepsie, Calgary, Watertown, yes. Bronx, Kingston, come on in. You're all welcome. This is great. Buffalo, Binghamton, Brooklyn, Staten Island, yes. Albany 518 in the house.
I saw Miami in there.
Middletown, Lansing, got Queens. We got from coast to coast, Suffolk County, Long Island. Yes, we're gonna let it fill up just a little bit and we will be beginning the presentation very soon. And we thank you for your time, each and every one of you.
This is wonderful. Saratoga.
We got the map covered.
I saw New Jersey.
Yes, it's always a pleasure to know where everyone is coming from. Yes, come on in. Got about 117. And most likely there will be more. And whenever you want to set up, Fanny, you got it.
Okay, thank you so much, Elijah. So good afternoon, everyone. I'll begin as people are still filtering in. We just love it. My name is Fanny Glover. I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion at the Early Care and Learning Council. And my colleague here, Elijah Falk, he is the announcer, and he's the one that's going to keep all the technology flowing for us. But before we get started, what I'd like to do is acknowledge the indigenous land and culture of New York. We honor the land as the Creator intended, in that we commit to keep it clean and support efforts to make it safe for all. We can show honor to the native keepers of the land by recognizing the value of their culture, by learning the truth of their history and how it shaped this great country. We are honored today to have with us a speaker that when I first heard him, I was like, oh my, I would love to have him present to our statewide network. And so here we are. Dreams do come true. So why we hate? He was a featured speaker. Our presenter today was a featured speaker from on a film produced by Alex Gibney and Steven Spielberg. If we all have, and this was the wording that we shared with all of you and that drew you here today, if we all have the capacity to hate, what does it take to awaken our worst tendencies? Journalist and author Jelani Cobb investigates and speaks to how hate tools like propaganda, dehumanization, the internet, symbols, and more can incite, amplify, and spread hatred. At the 2015 Hillman Prize ceremony, presenter and journalist Hendrik Hertzberg described the work of Jelani Cobb as combining the rigor and depth of a professional historian with the alertness of a reporter, the liberal passion of an engaged public intellectual, and the literary flair of a fine writer. His engaging presentations inspire us to work tirelessly toward achieving an ongoing dream of equity, of genuine democracy. They show us that not only are the levers of justice in our hands, but we can move them in the direction we see fit. And they remind us that the only obstacle holding us back is the comforting illusion that we've already achieved our goals. So something about our great speaker today. Dr. Jelani Cobb is a Columbia University, a Lippman Professor of Journalism and a longtime staff writer at The New Yorker, where his writing on race, history, justice, and politics earned him the Hillman Prize for opinion and analysis journalism. He is the author of Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip hop aesthetics, and This Devil and Dave Chappelle and other essays. He is also the recipient of the Walter Bernstein Award from the Writers Guild of America for his investigative series, Policing the Police, which aired on PBS Frontline. He is the editor of the Essential Herald Cruise, a reader, born and raised in Queens, New York. He is a graduate of Howard University and Rutgers University, where he received his doctorate in American history.
You don't have to read that.
I'm stopping. That was my last statement. Okay. And now I turn the floor over to Dr. Cobb. There you are.
So thank you. I first want to say thank you to Fanny for her extraordinary persistence in making this happen. She tried to contact me, I don't know how many times, but I wasn't getting the messages. So it wasn't that I was ignoring her. And then, I found out and I was like, what is this, 12 messages? So I should either do this event or, call the police and say I have a stalker. But I'm grateful for your persistence because this conversation is important. And I'm always appreciative of the opportunity to talk about these issues and to talk about really how we got to the place where we are in this society. The fact that you first saw my work with the documentary series Why We Hate is interesting because there's the story of how that project came about is really relevant to our times. And so I'll tell you a little bit about what I do, the work I do, how that project came about, what we explored in the course of that project, and some of the things that we've learned as a result of it. So first, I'm a historian and a journalist. When I was a young person, I thought that I had to do one thing or another. When I was in college, I went to Howard University. When I was in college, I was an English major and a history minor. And when it came time to graduate, there was this big question about whether I was going to pursue my interests in journalism and writing, or I was going to pursue my interest in history and become a professor. And I never quite decided. I just wound up doing both of those things. And it's been helpful because working as a journalist, when we deal with current events, I always look at the historical background of those current events. And so I see the connection between the present and the past. And when I'm working in history, I'm looking at the past, but I'm also thinking about what the implications of these events or these actions are for our present. And so it's kind of always going backward and forward. And that's how I've come to understand things. This was particularly important in June of 2015. I was up late working on a story. I'm a staff writer for The New Yorker. And sometimes the day gets very crowded and you don't have time to really focus on the thing, on your thoughts until late in the evening. And so I began working on a project and it's about 11 o'clock at night. Usually I would shut down all of my social media while I was doing this. I don't know why my social media was open on my computer, but it was kind of scrolling on the side of the screen. It was going crazy. And I ignored it, and then it said, okay, I just should just see what this is. And this was the social media response to an unconfirmed shooting that happened in the basement of a Black church in Charleston, South Carolina. That's all we knew. Over time, I start digging, I realized that this story is going to be more pressing and more important for the news than the story I was working on. And so I start digging into details and calling people I know in Charleston and trying to figure out what the story is. And it is what we have come to know now as the massacre at the Emmanuel AME Church, in which 9 people were murdered by the white supremacist Dylann Roof. And they were murdered as they prayed. They had invited him, a stranger, into their midst to join their prayer service. And in response, he pulled out a firearm and shot them fatally. Shot 8 of those people fatally. A 9th died in the hospital, shortly thereafter. And so this is a horrifying story. And it's a terribly common story. It's something that we see frequently. Unfortunately, as I was about to sign on here, I got a news alert that there had been a mass shooting on the West Coast. This is a tragic, terrible feature of our lives. But there was more to this than simply an incident of mass violence. The rationale and reasoning for Dylann Roof's actions were chilling, terrifying, horrifying, but all too resonant with themes in the history of the United States. When he was captured in North Carolina, his family identified him, gave his name when they saw the images that were being shown on local media. They recognized who he was, they identified him. And when he was arrested, he was brought in very casually, very relaxed, had a conversation with the police detective and began talking about why he had committed the killings. He said that he had done it as a wake-up call for white people, that he had no choice as he saw it, that white people were being marginalized in American society. And he had killed these people in order to tell them to wake up and presume their rightful place at the head of society. This was not coincidentally something that happened during the course of the first Black presidency. This was in the second term of Barack Obama's presidency, this happened. And so I began digging into this, and it was, as a historian, one of the first things that struck me was that he had attacked an AME church. The AME Church as a denomination came about, it was founded in Philadelphia in the late 18th century as a result of Black worshipers being physically ejected from a sanctuary, a church sanctuary, for praying in too close a proximity to their white fellow worshipers. And so this church began as a sanctuary for Black people from racism. The specific church that they were talking about here, the Emmanuel AME Church, in the kind of center of downtown Charleston, on Calhoun Street, which we'll come back to in a minute. The Emmanuel Church was particularly important because it was partly founded by Denmark Vesey, who, those of us who recall our African-American history, know that he attempted to mount a mass insurrection in Charleston to overthrow the regime of slavery and free the enslaved Black people in the city. He had learned of the Haitian Revolution, what Toussaint Louverture had achieved there, and wanted to achieve the same in South Carolina. He was betrayed and killed. The church was burned to the ground, and it was rebuilt as a structure, as a symbol of the resilience of the Black community there. So there are all these layers that are operating. One of the things that I pointed out to people in the course of this was that Dylann Roof committed these murders on June 16th, 2015. On June 15th, there was an announcement of a presidential candidacy from a New York real estate figure whose political aspirations no one took very seriously. It was notable to me that there were, within 24 hours, 2 recurrences of the same idea. The first was that during the course of the campaign announcement, Donald Trump said that he was running because the country was besieged by Mexican rapists, as he framed it. Trafficking in an old idea that there are white people, specifically white women, who are imperiled by depraved and dangerous men of color who are intent upon committing sexual assaults. For those of us who know American history, we know that this is a very resonant idea, that this was an idea that was used with great frequency in the aftermath of slavery to justify measures that circumvented Black people's citizenship. 24 hours later, in the course of the shooting spree, a young man by the name of Tywanza Sanders, who had been shot but had not yet succumbed to his wounds, began asking Dylann Roof questions. Now, the reason we know this is because Tywanza Sanders' mother was laying on the floor pretending to be dead. In the frenzy of shooting, Dylann Roof had lost track of who he had shot. And she was laying on the floor pretending to be dead. She had to do this because her body was laying on top of her 11-year-old granddaughter. So in the course of this, as she sees her son bleeding, she can't go to him and help him because she's trying to protect the life of her 11-year-old granddaughter. And as he's injured, he says to Dylann Roof, "You don't have to do this. We mean you no harm." And then and asks, "Why are you doing this?" And Roof says in response that he has to do it because, quote, "Your people are raping our women and taking over the world." So we heard this language of dark male predators being deployed twice in 24 hours in very different contexts, but eliciting the same sorts of outrage and fear. 2 different responses to the same idea that white people were imperiled. I began writing about this. And in the course of writing about it, the team from Alex Gibney's production company and Steven Spielberg reached out and wanted to know if I would be interested in collaborating with them on a project they were also doing. And their project was called Why We Hate. The rise of a radical far right-wing militia movement and white nationalist movement that coincided with a national intolerance of immigration, both quote unquote legal and illegal, when we looked at the polls, and a public polling phenomenon in which we would see significant numbers of white people who would argue that the most disadvantaged group in American society was in fact white people. All of these things came together in a particularly volatile moment, and is the moment in which we see Dylann Roof commit the act that he committed. But this doesn't come from nowhere. It doesn't just come out of the blue. How is it that this person found encouragement in like-minded individuals? What were the antecedents, the things that prefaced these actions that made his behaviors more likely? How did he understand the world? And what are the commonalities between what he saw and what we've seen in incidents of similar violence in Pittsburgh, where the synagogue was attacked, in El Paso, where the Walmart was attacked. We could talk about the incidents that we've seen abroad, too many of them to name, but in the numbers of similar attacks, the attack in New Zealand stands out for these similar dynamics. So I'll tell you about a conversation that I had in the course of this film, and then it will hopefully elucidate some of the ideas that we're going to get at. We traveled to South Carolina, where I spoke with a gentleman from the South Carolina Secessionist Party. He was arguing in defense of the Confederacy and saying that the Confederacy had been an honorable cause and that people who fought within it were not seeking to extend slavery, that they were fighting for other personal, more abstract reasons. And which doesn't hold up historically. In the course of that conversation, I said, well, it's hard to believe that these people were not fighting for slavery when the state legislature of South Carolina, in its Declaration of Secession, specifically says that they are leaving the Union in order to protect slavery. And when you go back and read the declarations that these legislatures passed right before the Civil War begins, in state after state after state, they say slavery, that we are fighting to protect slavery. And he counters and says, well, the average person wasn't really thinking about that. They were just thinking about the fact that they were called to go off to war. And it was like, were they though? Because the way that we wound up with the state of West Virginia is that Virginia seceded from the Union, and then the western part of Virginia seceded from Virginia in an effort to stay out of the war. Similar phenomena happened in Eastern Tennessee, which nearly separated from Western Tennessee in the course of the war. Many people abandoned the side that they were born to and fought over the side that they thought was right. So that can't quite explain it. And then he said something really striking. He said, well, most people who fought were not, most people who supported the war, and most South Carolinians didn't support the war because they hated Black people. Now there's a very important asterisk in South Carolina history, which is that because of the nature of the agriculture there, and also the nature of the climate and the low country, it was much more hospitable to people who had immunity to malaria than it was to people who did not. And people from the western coast of Africa tended to have this thing, what we call the sickle cell trait now, which made malaria gave malaria a much more difficult time infecting them. For that reason, there were lots more people who were enslaved and imported into South Carolina than there were in neighboring places. In fact, Black people made up the majority of the population. So in the course of this conversation, he said, most South Carolinians didn't support the war because they hated Black people. And I said, most South Carolinians were Black people. And there was this dramatic pause in the conversation because I don't think he had ever countenanced the idea that all of these people in South Carolina were in fact South Carolinians. There was an idea that South Carolinians were white and slaves were something else. And so the denial of what this war had been about fostered the cult of the lost cause. And to this day, Charleston, which is perennially cited as one of the best places to visit for vacation, one of the best places to go for honeymoons, one of the best places to go for family reunions and those sorts of events, all of those things belie the fact that it is a tribute to the cause of slavery. And you can find these gigantic memorials to the Confederate war dead, to the various figures. Calhoun Street, where the church is located, is named after John Calhoun, who was the intellectual godfather of secession and an avowed white supremacist. They have so distinguished the idea of slavery and racism from the cause of the South that when you walk down Calhoun Street, where the statue of John Calhoun once stood, was taken down last year, but when you walk down Calhoun Street, if you ever saw that statue, you would be struck by the fact that it was literally about 100 feet away from the South Carolina Holocaust Memorial. There was no apparent contradiction between memorializing people whose lives had been stolen by a cause steeped in racism and honoring literally this towering figure of one of the benchmark white supremacists of American history. And so there are these symbols that create a culture and an environment. There's a lineage and a history of violence and lynching in South Carolina that contextualizes what Roof believes. There's the propaganda and a kind of inversion that he encounters on the internet. And so in the course of doing this work, one of the things that became notable to us is when we talk about people who hate, they don't think of themselves as haters. Almost never do they think this. Roof does not say anywhere in his manifesto that he hates Black people. He simply says that he is trying to protect white people. So the hater, we tend to think of hate as this volatile emotion. We tend to associate it with anger, that a person who hates is easily discernible by their temperament and their behavior. And sometimes that's true, but there was nothing overtly volatile about Roof or many of the other people who we've seen commit these atrocities. One, in the aftermath, when the news reporter invariably interviews their next door neighbor, what is it that the neighbor always says? He was so quiet. Not, he was fuming, I once saw him kick a puppy. It's always, he was so quiet. The person who is possessed by hate tends to believe that they, in fact, have found clarity. And their actions, the actions that stem from this, are merely the logical extension of what must happen. When you go back and read Hitler's speeches and Hitler's rhetoric, they say that they refer to the Holocaust as the final solution. But if you listen to them, these are just people saying that they're solving a problem. If there's a problem that has fallen to them, they have to solve it. And so the person who is the hater tends to have been seduced by a series of premises which lead to a hateful conclusion. And each premise pushes slightly closer. Ideas that are defensible to ideas that are less defensible, to premises that that are not supported by the facts, to ultimately indefensible actions or indefensible conclusions that lead to abominable actions. And this tends to be the chain, which makes it that much more difficult to discuss because the observer does not necessarily see this person as steeped in hate or hatred either. We have some recognizable characteristics though. There tends to be the rhetoric of dehumanization. The people who we are talking about, the people who are the object of scorn, are never just people. They are associated with animals that are reviled. And so this is, as we've seen time and time again, We've seen this with the Rohingya Muslims. We have seen this in Rwanda, in the mass killings that took place there in the 90s. We have seen this in the course of American slavery. We've seen this in too many instances to identify. There's always the attempt to rhetorically strip the humanity of the individuals who you are talking about. There's also a corollary tendency to associate these people with these individuals or these groups with physical uncleanliness. And so it is, how many often I would say would you have a ethnic group prefaced by the word dirty or filthy, things that are meant to evoke disgust. There's a psychologist, a late psychologist, who was a friend of mine who did amazing work on this, Emile Bruneau, who talked about the way that people associate objects of disgust with people in order to transfer the sentiment or the revulsion that you have toward uncleanliness, which is, some people believe, a kind of evolutionary function. Things that we find disgusting are things that would tend to be associated with harmful bacteria that might make us sick. And so we would find things disgusting, and we then translate whatever it is that's disgusting onto these people with the implicit idea that they pose some sort of threat, which is the next part of this. There's typically an inversion wherein the people who commit acts, hateful acts of violence, are able to frame this as acts of self-defense. One of the benchmark examples of this is in the era of lynching in the United States. When you go back and read the rhetoric of lynchers and lynch mobs, they always deploy the idea of self-defense, that these absurdly over-the-top, brutal, horrifying acts of violence in which people are set on fire, castrated, their body parts are very often cut and kept as souvenirs. All of these things that happen are placed under the banner of community self-defense. And always that there was a kind of attempt to exorcise, really, a demon from their midst through the exhaustive use of violence. And this is why we see the pride associated with it. One of the reasons that we know, as much as we know about lynching in the United States, is that people were not ashamed of it. They took photographs. They sent postcards, as the display, the exhibit Without Sanctuary is a great example of, where they compiled these postcards. We can identify people, we can see their faces. The great historical analysis by Amy Louise Wood in a book called Lynching and Spectacle says the reason that we understand the posing next to the dead bodies, the prideful faces, is that they're connected to another genre of photography with which we're all familiar. And she said the lynching postcards are hunting photography. The image of the person holding up the fish that they caught, the image of the person holding up the horns of the buck that they shot, the image of the person who has mounted the head of the bear that they killed. And so all of these things play to a particular psychology, that we're not dealing with human beings, that we're responding to them in the way that we would respond to a fish or a deer or a bear, and so on. And finally, I want to say that there is a kind of societal custom that has given aid and comfort and really nurturance to the traditions of hate. When I went down to South Carolina for the trial, I made probably 6 or 7 trips to South Carolina over the course of this time. When the trial occurred, I would leave my hotel, walk from the hotel to the courthouse, which was maybe 8 blocks or 10 blocks. And then at the end of the proceedings for the day, walk back to my hotel. And one of the things I noticed, there was this building, it looked to be an old courthouse or something, and I didn't really pay much attention to it. And then one day I looked up and saw the sign that said Charleston Confederate Museum. So I stopped in, and I happened to still have my press badge on. There were 2 women there. It was a woman who was, 2 white women who were in, one was in her 40s, and I would guess one might be in her mid to late 60s. They could not have been nicer. They could not have been more welcoming. They looked at my press pass and wondered what brought me to town. And the younger woman, I told the younger woman, I'm a reporter and I'm here to cover the trial of Dylann Roof. And the older woman said, oh, we don't need a trial. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, just get rid of him. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, just get rid of him. And I said, well, it's interesting that you would say that because as we speak, the jury is deliberating about whether or not to give him the death penalty. And she said, no need to deliberate, just get rid of him. And so I asked what was to me the most logical and apparent question. What do you make of the fact that Dylann Roof did what he did in tribute to the cause that is being memorialized by this museum? And they were instantly very defensive. Oh, no, 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 no. What he did had nothing to do with the Confederacy. The Confederacy was not about hate. And I said, well, he carried the symbols of the Confederacy in all of those images that he posted before he committed these murders. He said, well, he didn't understand what he was seeing. And I said, well, what do you make of the fact that white supremacist organizations around the world fly the Confederate flag as a symbol of their allegiance to that cause? Well, people on the internet can just find anything. They don't understand what the Confederacy was really about. And they started talking, and in the course of this, the older woman said, one thing that I'm happy about is that after all this happened, they didn't let Black Lives Matter come in and burn the whole city down. Now, what I noticed as she was saying this was that she was standing next to a Confederate cannon. And my point was that Charleston was burned to the ground once, but it wasn't by Black Lives Matter. It was burned to the ground by the Union Army because it was one of the most valuable port cities to the Confederacy that was fighting to extend the right of white Southerners to buy, sell, rape, abuse, breed, traffic, and exploit Black human beings. But it's that very inversion that made what happened in the basement of that church almost predictable. Because Dylann Roof was many things, but he wasn't a liar. When he talked about what that cause had been dedicated to, the supremacy of white people, and wanting to resurrect that cause, he was speaking more truthfully about what that history stood for than the people who were the supposed caretakers of the objects and memorabilia associated with the Confederacy. There's one last thing that I'll tell you about this, and then I would like to get into some questions. That story ended in a very bizarre way. After the Dylann Roof trial ended, he was convicted, he was sentenced to death. I walked around the city, I went to Emmanuel AME to services, and then I booked a flight to San Francisco. I had an engagement, an invitation to speak in San Francisco. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to make it, depending on how long the jury deliberations went. And I decided that even though I had some time, I wanted to get out of Charleston immediately because I had this feeling of heaviness. So at 6 a.m., I flew on a Delta flight out of Charleston and landed in LaGuardia. I got to LaGuardia. I had some time to kill. I read some books, then hopped in a taxi and went to JFK, where I had a flight from JFK to SFO. If any of you all know that I just skipped over a lot when I said I hopped in a taxi and went from JFK, LaGuardia to JFK. That took a long time. You don't know that doesn't happen. That doesn't just happen. So I get there, I read some more, I board my flight. It's a 5-hour flight, 5.5-hour flight to San Francisco. I land, and when I get to my hotel, it occurs to me that I have not spoken to anyone that entire day. I've not uttered a word to another human being. The last conversation I'd had was with a gentleman named Melvin Graham, whose sister, Cynthia Graham Hurd, had died in the church. She was a librarian in Charleston. And I saw him at the courthouse, and he said, I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure the entire world knows how special and important my sister was. That's what he told me. So I go the entire day without talking to anybody. I get to the hotel, and just out of wanting to have small talk, I strike up a conversation with the bellman in the lobby. And I did what you do when you're talking to strangers. I asked where he was from. And I said, are you a native of the Bay Area? And he said, oh, I've been out here about 8 or 10 years now, but I'm not originally from here. I said, where are you from originally? And he said, I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. And I said, oh, wow, that's where I'm coming from. And he said, what brought you to Charleston? And I said, I was there to cover the trial of Dylann Roof. And he stopped, and this stricken, pained look came across his face. And he said, that man took someone very important to me. And I said, who? He said, my childhood librarian. Her name was Cynthia Graham Hurd. And it stopped me in my tracks that these two conversations I'd had were about this one person. And that at 5 o'clock that morning, I had been on the East Coast. Charleston is a port city. I was next to the Atlantic Ocean. That evening, I was on the West Coast at a hotel that was walking distance from the Pacific Ocean. I had gone as far as I could go in the United States, and the two people who I talked to had been mourning the same person. The bellman told me that when he was a child, his mother went back to school, and she was working, she was a single mother, and she would bring her children to the library where she would do her work for her classes. And Miss Hurd, the librarian, would always set out books and puzzles and things for them to do to keep them occupied while their mother tried to get her work done. And as a grown man, he remembered how special and important that was and how crucial she had been to helping his mother finish her education. What I took from that was the fact that this is not a problem of a single incident. It's not a problem of a single individual. It is a problem that spans the entire length of this country and spans the entire history in which it has existed. Thank you. We can have some questions now.
Wow. That sort of leaves me speechless. It just so powerful. And we're going to get to the question in just a moment. As someone wrote in the chat box, thank you so much for this, such a powerful story. And it was to leave the East Coast and go to the West Coast and be talking about it bring chills. I mean,
when this happened, first of all, I didn't believe it. And then the next thing I did was ask for his contact information, because I said, you know, my editors are going to believe, they're not going to believe this. They don't think this is made up, which they should, because it's too bizarre. But that was the conversation. And the interesting thing is that I had taken Melvin Graham's phone number after that conversation. And I think I took it before that conversation, but I immediately called him and said, you know, you're not going to believe this. So I got off this plane in San Francisco. I'm wandering around the city and I talked to this guy in a hotel, and he tells me he knew your sister and loved her and that she helped him. And he was like, why wouldn't I believe that? He said, I'm not surprised at all.
Yeah.
He said, that's who my sister was.
Wow. Wow. Oh, wow. I'm going to get to the question, but there's something in the chat box. And one participant writes, I'm in tears. I lived in Columbia, South Carolina for 9 years and have stories that no one believes here. I was born and raised in South Carolina. I went to a segregated school in South Carolina. I saw the colored signs in South Carolina. And I went to the same space that you did where that shooting took place in Charleston, South Carolina. And even still, I just find it so hard to wrap my mind around. So I just want to, you know, respond to or ask this question that someone has here in the box. And that is, can you speak to how to approach or manage conversations in the workplace in which those who speak to hate are marginalized?
So one of the things I think is important is that people defend their ideas, especially the ideas that they think are crucial to their understanding of the world. If you take someone who is a devout libertarian, if they really, really, really believe in the libertarian cause, and you try to dissuade them from that cause by showing them all the things that are wrong with libertarianism, one, they probably have defenses made up in their minds for those things already, and two, they're not likely to, even if they can't defend the idea, they're not likely to concede the point. It's just one of the things about human nature that we know. And so one of the things that I always suggest is asking questions. Because in asking questions of the person, you leave it to them to draw their own conclusions, and you leave it to them to potentially find the contradictions in these ideas. It's like the movie Inception, where you have to believe that it's your idea in order to believe in it. And so I think, especially in the workplace, it's more important to ask pointed questions, questions that highlight the inconsistencies, but to make fewer statements. As a matter of fact, I was just thinking about this today, that I wanted to share with my students this thing that I wrote with, you know, questions and then the greater than symbol statements. You know, questions are greater than statements, especially for people who are, you know, young budding reporters, but for people who are navigating these kind of circumstances too. And I will say that, quite frankly, that there is, and this is a lot of social science on this, there is not a kind of single way of dissuading people. When we talk about, you know, de-radicalization and, you know, people who have join terrorist causes and so on. It's not like there's a formula where people just kind of snap their fingers and say, okay, I no longer support Al-Qaeda. And it is kind of long, painstaking interactions in which you raise the questions that people have increasing difficulty answering.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I've seen dehumanization in full practice. Our organization, our industry is the early care. We work in the early care space. And one of the challenges we have in this space is expulsion and suspension of children, in particularly BIPOC children, in particularly little Black boys. And this theory, this dehumanization space that one have to put children in, and it's not done intentionally, like you were saying, that haters don't think that they're haters, you know?
Right.
You know, how do you, and I'm asking this question while others can put their questions in the box, because I still have the space here and you've given me the floor, unfortunately. So my question is, you know, how do you help those who do not know they are haters understand that they are operating in that space at that time, without injury,
without injury to the person who is unknowingly?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's, again, that these things are even more important to raise those kinds of concerns obliquely. When you were asking, so explain to me how this happened, or explain to me what the thinking is, so what would be the implication of this? And one of the things that I found in those kinds of conversations is that sometimes people will themselves recognize, what it is that they've done wrong, which is valuable. But, the fact of it is, again, we're very reluctant to do that, especially in front of other people. You may at 2 o'clock in the morning think about something and go, oh, that was the wrong thing. Now I do think in some egregious instances, you have to point that out. It's not so much a matter of personal or emotional conversion as it is enforcing a policy that is, even and equal, for people. And so one of the things that people will say, like, okay, well, explain to me how it is that suspension rates look the way that they do for similar offenses and similar behaviors. I know with my daughter, I have a 29-year-old daughter, and what's today's date? She'll be 29 tomorrow. So I have a 29-year-old daughter, and when she was in school, that's not her. That's my 4-year-old right there. But when, and also giving like the shout out to everybody, I also have 19-month-old twins. So just a whole span of them. But when we sent her to school, we found one of the best schools we could in New York City. She, loved the environment, loved the campus. And then she witnessed a situation where a Black girl and a white girl got into an argument. The Black girl was ejected from the school and the white girl was just sent back to class. And, even, as a person who's nearly 30, she still talks about that as being a defining moment in her life, and understanding the tilted scale, especially, which is so funny because New York loves to think of itself as the home of this kind of touchy-feely liberalism. Like we all vote for Democrats, but you have the same sort of statistics as the people who vote for Republicans. When you look at your schools and you look at the kinds of unemployment and healthcare access and all that other stuff, you're just nicer about it. And so I think that it has to be important. It's important to sometimes just point out these things, even if it's not a matter of the personal conversion,
Absolutely. So here's a question that was definitely on my mind, and I was going to go there next, but someone else is asking it. Do schools teach appropriate history in present day? And the writer goes on, when I went to school, I was not taught any of these things and had to educate myself as I became an adult. It
Well,
is very sad.
no, we're not. And that's still a battle we're having now. As you saw just last week, this week actually, Texas voted on that bill to prohibit the teaching of lots of things, including slavery, the centrality of slavery in Texas history. And so when we talk about this, it's astounding that people in Texas did this, because we could talk about the states of the Confederacy and say that they fought to protect slavery, which they refuse to admit, but it's true. They fought to protect slavery, except that Texas fought 2 wars to protect slavery. That slavery was at the center of the reason why they seceded from Mexico and then joined the Union and seceded from that. And then went through, as we will recognize next month, all the twists and turns that they went through in order to prevent people from even knowing that slavery was over. And that's only the people who were stationary. There were other people who were moving their slaves around the state to try to prevent them from being in areas where the Union Army could enforce emancipation. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this was really important to you. And if it was that important to you, then the young people who have been educated in that state need to know that.
Yes, absolutely. And I noticed here, one of our participants said approximately a month ago, Oklahoma. Similar, yeah.
A whole raft of states have been passing these laws. And if you recall, about 2 years ago, Texas wanted to refer to people who were enslaved as quote unquote workers and immigrants. And so it's a kind of cult of euphemism. And so that's what I mean about people who are the kind of mechanisms for hate. There's a deep emotional, psychological reason for not being able to say, look, we enslaved these people. And these people, what they refer to them by what they were referred to at the time. They were called slaves. They were not called workers. But they want to provide a circumstance, to create the circumstances in which white people can believe that their state and that their government was not responsible, was not guilty of unspeakable atrocities. And until we can confront that reality, we have no hope of transcending it. But people think, oh, you're trying to bring up this history, you're trying to make us feel bad. No, I'm trying to prevent bad things from happening in the future, because we haven't acknowledged the bad things that happened in the past. It's like a good friend of mine was saying that his wife went to the doctor, went to a checkup, and the doctor found cancer. And she was like, oh, I knew I shouldn't have gone to that doctor. And he was like, no, I'm glad you did go to that doctor, because she was thinking about, if I didn't go to the doctor, I wouldn't have this burden right now. But he was thinking, they caught this early, and this was 10 or 12 years ago. She survived, she had treatment and everything, but we can actually do something about it because we've actually acknowledged this problem exists. Yeah. And so we have not gotten to the place in the society where we are prepared and equipped to deal with the diagnosis. And so we can't possibly start the treatment.
Oh, wow. Dealing with the diagnosis. Dr. Cobb, this has truly been amazing, very informative, very engaging. And we are hoping that you will consider coming back for a part 2. I promise not to call 12 times.
Well, I think it should probably be easier to get in touch with me now.
Right.
But yeah, I would love to come back and visit you all again.
Wonderful. This has been totally fabulous. And I can't thank you enough for coming and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. And we just, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so very much. And for all of you are asking about the recording, yes, we can do something about that. Thank you. Thank you all. Right. You could have spent your hour someplace, but you spend it with us. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cobb. Have a wonderful evening.
You too.
Yes. Thank you so much.